let's take a look together at Margaret Atwood's poem, The City Planners, which is one of the 15 poems that you'll need to know for your Paper 1 Poetry and Prose exam. So even though this is going to be part of a prepared paper, many of the techniques that we're going to be using in order to look at this poem are things that will also be useful to you if you choose the poetry option on the Paper 4 Unseen. So we'll sort of point some of those things out as we go. So when approaching the poem, one of the first things that you want to do is look at the title, The City Planners. So what does that already tell us? Well, a city planner is someone who is tasked with organizing and structuring a city or an area before it's even been built. So they're the ones who are arranging things before they even come into being. So thinking about organization and structure is going to be really important here. So that's something that we're also going to want to think about when we look at the organization of the stanzas and things like rhyme and line length within the poem as well. So we'll maybe look at that quickly before we read the poem and then come back to that in a little bit. So as we can see, and I know we can't fit all of this on the screen at one time, we've got stanzas that are of consistently diminishing length here, right? There's no regularity in their size, but we do see that they grow shorter as the poem continues. So we're just going to make a note of that over here. And think about that a little bit more after we've read the poem. One thing that we can also see from a quick glance at the poem is that there's no set line length and no rhyme scheme. So knowing that we already are looking at a poem that's about people whose job it is to organize and structure, the idea that we have a poem that does not have a set organizational pattern or structure is something that we should definitely be keeping in mind as we read this poem. So before we dive into some of the rest of the text, we should read the poem to get a sense of it as a whole. Cruising these residential Sunday streets in dry August sunlight, what offends us is the sanities, the houses in pedantic rows, the planted sanitary trees, assert levelness of surface like a rebuke to the dent in our car door. No shouting here or shatter of glass, nothing more abrupt than the rational whine of a power mower cutting a straight swath in the discouraged grass. But though the driveways neatly sidestep hysteria by being even, the roofs all display the same slant of avoidance to the hot sky, certain things. The smell of spilt oil, a faint sickness lingering in the garages, a splash of paint on brick, surprising as a bruise, a plastic hose poised in a vicious coil. Even the too-fixed stare of the wide windows give momentary access to the landscape behind or under the future cracks in the plaster. When the houses, capsized, will slide obliquely into the clay seas, gradual as glaciers that right now nobody notices. That is where the city planners, with the insane faces of political conspirators, are scattered over unsurveyed territories, concealed from each other, each in his own private blizzard. Guessing directions, they sketch transitory lines, rigid as wooden borders on a wall in the white vanishing air, tracing the panic of suburb order in the bland madness of snows. So before we get into a close reading of the text, we want to think a little bit about what is actually just happening here. What are we looking at? So we can see quite clearly that we have a distaste for the orderliness of the suburbs. And we have a bit of a disdain for those city planners. So we want to keep all of that in mind as we look more closely at specific elements within the text. So we'll head back to the beginning and what we see. We start off with this very sort of lovely scene, right? Cruising these residential Sunday streets in a dry August sunlight. We have this very casual and pleasant atmosphere. The idea of cruising, so we're driving without any sort of destination. And then in terms of our situation in time, we have Sunday, which is a day of rest, and August, so this idea of summer, right? So summer, which often is perceived as being a bit more leisurely and a bit more casual, a time for more enjoyment than the rest of the year. Again, Sunday, a weekend day, one that is meant to be a day of rest, a day for pleasant things. So we're out for a Sunday drive, and it's supposed to be this very sort of lovely experience. But that gets destroyed pretty quickly in that next line, right? We have what offends us. So the people who are in the car with the speaker of the poem are now offended, which is a pretty harsh word, especially because we've been, on this lovely Sunday drive. And so we've got something that's sort of horrible going on now. And what is that is offensive? Well, in what is it offending? It's offending their sanity, right? So it's offensive to the point of making them feel insane. So what is it about that place, that residential street, that is making them lose their sanity? The houses in pedantic rows, the planted sanitary trees, assert levelness of surface like a rebuke to the dent in our car door. So let's go through those things a little bit. So being pedantic, sort of overly correcting of small errors. So overly perfect and sort of nitpicky and correcting of small errors. Ooh, going off the screen. There we go. So we've got the houses. The rows are so perfect that no error is allowed in how they're lined up. Then even the planted sanitary trees, right? So a tree, something that's a piece of nature, is not something that we typically think of being sanitary, overly clean. So even the nature is sanitized. And then we have this just utter and complete levelness of surface. So something that, without any sort of variation, any sort of difference. And all of this sort of orderliness and perfection, we've got this simile here. It's like a rebuke. So the orderliness and the perfection is chastising them for not being perfect, for having something like a dent in their car door. And just to solidify that extreme order, we have no shouting here or shatter of glass. Nothing more abrupt than the rational whine of a power mower cutting a straight swath in the discouraged grass. So we've got this extreme level of order, right? So the only abrupt sound is something that's being used to create even further order, because that pesky grass can't be allowed to grow too high, and it's got to be cut into perfectly straight lines. Just moving back a bit, we also should not think that it was unintentional to have sanities here and sanitary there. This idea of this overly clean, overly perfect sort of situation being linked to one's mental health and one's sanity. Atwood is very intentionally using these words that sound similar. Moving on to the second stanza, we begin with but, which means that we should ready ourselves for some sort of contrast, right? Whenever we see that conjunction, we should know that some type of contrast is to come, especially when we're seeing it at the beginning of a stanza. Though the driveways neatly sidestep hysteria, so we've got further markers of insanity. And what's interesting here is that hysteria is linked to a particularly womanly type of insanity, something that Atwood, based upon her other writings and her feminist leanings, would not be unaware of in terms of the use of this word, that it's a insanity typically reserved specifically for women. So we've got the neat driveways that are sidestepping hysteria. So we've got this sort of interplay of what's being done to avoid madness is actually causing madness in the speaker. So they sidestep hysteria by being even. The roofs all display the same slant of avoidance to the hot sky, certain things. And then after this colon, we get our list. We're here introducing our list of imperfections. And when we see they're all linked figuratively in some way with something that is damaging or sick. So we first have a smell of spilt oil, a faint sickness lingering in the garages. So we've got that metaphor there. A splash of paint on brick, surprising as a bruise. So we have simile here. Plastic hose poised in a vicious coil. So that's another metaphor, as we are implying that this hose is some sort of snake ready to strike. Even the too fixed stare of the wide windows. So we've got the personification of the windows. And all of these things have some sense of danger or illness about them, right? Sickness, bruises, snakes ready to strike, these staring eyes of the windows. So we have this sort of, we have this idea of danger in these imperfections. Now, we can tell from what the speaker has said in the rest of the poem that they don't really see these imperfections as something that is dangerous, right? There's a sarcasm here that before they've been very critical of the overly perfect nature of the suburb. But here, when we've got, this is more of the city planner's idea of how they would view the imperfections that they're seeing. So these give momentary access to the landscape behind or under the future cracks in the plaster. So we're beginning to see that there is some sort of danger for the inhabitants of this place as well, right? That this is something that cannot last. Moving on. When the house is capsized, will slide obliquely into the clay seas, gradual as glaciers, that right now nobody notices. So we've got these sort of sea metaphors of the houses being crashed almost like they're ships and being washed away. But we have this idea that there is this impermanence to the place, that the destruction and disruption of nature that has happened is going to leave them vulnerable. which is why we've got references to seas and glaciers, sort of these powerful forces of nature that are being used metaphorically here or here within that simile, but that the destruction of this suburb is going to happen as certainly as forces of nature exist. But right now, nobody notices. So right now, this is currently hidden, this danger. Now we get back to our title of the poem. So we have, that is where the city planners, and we have the use of capitals here, right, as a title, as a designation, as this sort of reverence for that role. Now we know that this is kind of a mocking reverence, right, that our speaker does not actually feel reverent towards these people, but it's this mocking, sarcastic tone. With the insane faces of political conspirators. So we're going back again to this idea of sanity and how this overly structured situation, this overly structured city or suburb is creating insanity. And now the planners themselves are insane. And we've got these political conspirators. So we've got this idea that they are ill-intentioned. They're scattered over unsurveyed territories, concealed from each other, each in his own private blizzard. So we have this idea that they're hidden from view, they're hidden from reality, hidden from each other even. And then there's further criticism of how they undergo their job, right? We have that they're guessing directions. They're guessing here. So that's the opposite of orderly. That's not orderly. That's not intentional. They're guessing. They sketch transitory or impermanent lines, rigid as wooden borders on a wall in the white, vanishing air. So there's this, again, this sense of impermanence to everything, tracing the panic of suburb order in a bland madness of snows. So we have the juxtaposition here of panic and bland, right? That how can something that is so orderly be a panic? And even here we've got this oxymoron of bland madness of snows. Right? How can something that is so sort of orderly, contained, be crazy, be mad? So if we're looking at our sort of major themes here, we can see that we've got major ideas of sort of creativity and the problems when creativity and individuality are stifled. We see the possible damage caused by perfection and order. We see conflict here between the natural world and the human world, and humans trying to overtake nature, that eventually nature will prevail, even though we're just going to continue to build more and more of these soulless suburbs. Now, coming back to some of our ideas from the very beginning when we were starting to look at structure, now we can see where the poem is so very clearly really looking at the problems of an overly structured existence. All of the disorder that we see in the structure of the poem is incredibly intentional, right? So first we've got, the breaking down of the stanzas, that they're diminishing over time. First, just the fact that they're not regular lengths, but that they become shorter and shorter as we go along to show the breaking down of this perfect society. So we've got diminishing stanza length equals breaking down of the perfect suburb. And then going along with structure, we see lots of enjambment in the poem, which is where we've got the thought spilling over to the next line. So we see our line breaks are in some very strange places where it doesn't seem natural, where you really have to read through the line break in order to get the meaning. We also have some very strange punctuation here with, you know, colons upon colons and some very sort of difficult structures to sentences, which again is all intentional here, that we're trying to have this disorder as we're sort of trying to praise a certain amount of disorder coming out of all of this order. So going back to some of that enjambment, we even see what offends us is the sanities, right? The planted sanitary trees. Most of our lines here, even or shatter of glass, we're not breaking in natural ways. We don't have no shouting here, line break, or shatter of glass, line break, right? We're not breaking at phrases and clauses with our lines. We're intentionally spilling over from one line to the next. So this also is creating this sort of inevitability and this passage of time, this movement as all of this sort of keeps pushing forward and falling forward within the text, because you're not having these sort of clear stops. We do also see that as we get further down, right, even between stanzas. To fixed stare of wide windows give momentary access. So when between stanzas 1 and 2, we end at a very natural place and begin with this clear contrast. As we get further along, even the stanzas are spilling into each other a bit. We see that as well as we get into our final, our final 3 stanzas, right? Where we've got this first one that's starting with a lowercase that's part of this same sentence. And again, white vanishing air tracing the panic of suburb. So we've got this spilling over between the stanzas that's trying to show us the beauty that can come from disorder. So our main ideas here, as we're thinking about, well, what would be some potential exam questions that you might see? You might see something about one of these themes. You might see something that, how does the poet vividly convey the speaker's thoughts and feelings about the city planners, right? So we're really looking at this idea of order and disorder, this distaste for this artificial orderliness in replacement of nature, how that has an impact on one's sanity. So you want to think about all of those things, thinking about also the structure of the poem itself and how that really enhances Atwood's meaning here. In many of the poems that we read, the structure won't be quite so important, but this is one where you definitely would want to include that within your analysis.